Unless your internet bubble is extremely well fortified, you're probably aware of the paranoia that has arisen on the right. And no, I'm not talking about the election, but about what the World Economic Forum and Goldman Sachs are calling the Great Reset.
I feel a terrible, dreadful purpose of every cell in my body demanding we resist these people and say no to their GMO takeover, their 5G, their world government. The top epidemiologist, top expert on viruses in Canada says it's a giant, overblown hoax, just a regular cold or flu that Bill Gates again owns so he can say everybody's guilty and that's going to cause a planetary depression, which it already is. This is the globalists admitting it's a war, a weapon, and people finally get, I wasn't just making this up. So I want to go to Nick Fuentes here, sharing the mic.
It's easy to dismiss Jones when he spouts about eugenics and 5G and all the fear about the globalists. But if we're to be more than partisans, we should try to find the rational kernel in his ravings. His characterization of COVID, for instance, is essentially correct. COVID is a weapon. It's a weapon that the bankers and industrialists and politicians are using against the masses. COVID is being used as a weapon even though it is not a hoax. COVID is being used as a weapon even though the idea of reset isn't really an idea at all, but an exercise in branding. The global pandemic is being used as a weapon because under capitalism, everything is used as a weapon. It's a weapon because every day brings another battle in what has been a long class war. In this video, we'll explore how it is that the American left, and perhaps the international left, often finds itself on the wrong side of that class war. By re-examining an idea from Christopher Lasch's book, The Agony of the Left, we'll consider how the idea of a reset is offered up as a substitute for the idea of revolution. But even as we critique the current left, we'll turn to Michael Brooks and his book, Against the Web, in an effort to stave off the right-wing reactionaries who are attempting to rebrand themselves as the new protectors of a working class that really is under attack from capital's progressive wing. Where we should begin is with the ubiquity of technocracy during today's crisis. While many people on the right claim to stand against the global capitalist agenda, what they fail to recognize is how much agreement there is amongst elites.
Regeneron, you also said a vaccine will be coming within weeks?
Yes.
Is that a guarantee?
No, it's not a guarantee, but it will be by the end of the year. But I think it has a good chance. There are two companies, I think, within a matter of weeks, and it will be distributed very quickly.
Can you tell us which companies?
Johnson & Johnson is doing very well. Moderna is doing very well. Pfizer is doing very well, and we have numerous others.
How soon do you expect a candidate to be approved?
Well, I think likely early next year, with any luck, we'll have 2 or 3 of the 6 that are in phase 3 trials right now. The Pfizer has a good chance of being amongst the first of those. They're a very experienced vaccine company and designed their study very well. But also, AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, Novavax, Moderna, Sanofi. We should have choices of vaccines sometime early next year.
Before COVID, the idea of a reset was already being floated in places like the Financial Times. The need for the investment class to use their institutions to overcome the problems still lingering after the 2008 economic crisis. The notion that capital itself could become the humanitarian actor that the world needs. That finance and productive capital could work together to create green jobs, to support consumer protection, and even to regulate themselves. Resetting capitalism was in the interest of capitalism, and in the interest of the capitalist class. In 2019, the Financial Times described the reset as a shift from shareholders to stakeholders. That is, a shift away from a focus on short-term profit-making and towards the aim of meeting the needs of the community in order to protect the long-term viability of any given asset. This meant understanding that, for example, a company's relationship with its own workers, the communities where its plants are located, the customers who rely on their products, and even the environment has to be just as important as the relationship between investment and profit. What the conservatives fear about reset is, of course, not this sort of basic level progressive PR spin, but the stuff that sounds like communism. The stuff that, if read in a certain way, might even be communism. In an essay published by the World Economic Forum and touted in a video that has raised the hackles of many conservative commentators, the Danish parliamentarian Ida Auken wrote that, in her vision of the future, people wouldn't own anything, but would instead simply take what they needed from a common store or hoard whenever they needed something. She described a world without shopping, a world where transportation was free, and where energy was both free and clean, a world wherein everything was delivered by algorithm. In her future, everything would be efficient, organized, and useful. Everything would be surveilled and digitized. It's only when this promise of owning nothing, but rather taking what you need from a common store in a world where energy is clean and free, is made practical and turned into a soundbite, that it seems pretty sinister. The World Economic Forum doesn't say that everything will be free when you own nothing, but rather that you'll only have the option to rent what you need. And in an instant, the promise of utopia turns into the threat of living in a company town. What could be the dream of freedom is turned into a kind of digitized middle-class nightmare, brought to you by Patagonia and Amazon. Hello, Zero Books readers and viewers. It's me again, Douglas Lane. And in this video, I'll be taking a look at one reason why even the best critics of the left, from the left, people like Christopher Lasch, failed to break with the assumptions that had led to this moment where the World Economic Forum can turn a vision of communist utopia into an advert for Amazon drones. And at the outset, I'll read you a quote from Michael Brooks, Against the Web. In his book Against the Web, Brooks makes a special effort to fight against what he called the usual Eurocentric claim that the tradition that produced human rights flowed from Greece through Rome, through Europe, to America. He rejected that narrative because the struggle for human dignity has always been fragmented, multicultural, and global, and because the West's history is hardly an unbroken chain of progress toward social equality. I would add another reason to reject that narrative, namely, the vision of freedom that we have today, with all its contradictions, doesn't arise from ancient Greece or from Rome, but rather from the distorted vision of Greece and Rome that Westerners cling to as a new kind of freedom destroys their tradition. It's industrial capital that destroys and replaces traditions, whether they are traditions around forms of freedom, around the family, or religious traditions. As Moich Bastone put it in his book, Time, Labor, and Social Domination, capitalism arrived contingently in Europe, but it became a world system, and it represented a break or turn away from what we can conceive of as a strictly Western tradition. Bastone goes on to say that this capitalist society is also known as modernity. It is also known as an iron cage or a black iron prison, a world wherein our very freedom is turned into a kind of slavery. The left's, and especially the socialist left's, task has been to discover how to escape from this cage, how the development of the cage includes not only an escape hatch, but a new form of life based on realized liberty. And the career of Christopher Lasch might best be understood as one wherein he participated in that struggle for an escape hatch, only to find it had disappeared. In his book, The Agony of the Left, Lasch argued that after the Second World War, the American industrial proletariat no longer recognized or organized itself in opposition to the main institutions of society because poverty was eliminated from the corporate industrial sphere. In 1969, it seemed to Lasch and to many others that the new monopolized capitalism had overcome the problems that led to poverty for the ethnic majorities living in or around cities. This had led quite naturally to the remnants of the left that remained, turning to ethnic minorities, students, and the newly proletarianized women to be the new revolutionaries, or, if not that, then to be the new base for the left's disjointed political projects. Lasch was a contrarian in his time. He was quick to criticize the prevailing myths of the New Left and to critique his own side ruthlessly. However, his understanding of the capitalist dynamic, that is, of the set of relations that lay beneath the cultural tendencies that he could so expertly grasp and analyze, was not out of step with his contemporaries, but rather his thinking was very much the same as most other post-war radicals. Just as the Frankfurt School philosopher Max Horkheimer wrote in 1943, Lasch believed that global capitalism was undergoing a process wherein the competitive market as a regulator of production would be gradually abolished. Instead, production and with it the rest of life would be determined by statistics and in accordance with the policies of the new ruling class. Like Cornelius Castoriadis and the rest of the members of the Marxist sectarian group Facing Reality, Lasch believed that modern people were losing their ability to think beyond themselves, and that modern society renders its citizens ever more rootless in their local habitations, ever more mobile, ever more atomistic. But what we should note is that the political economic critique, the foundation that these beliefs were built upon, itself led to both the acceptance of the world as it is and was at odds with the Marxist tradition that Horkheimer, Castoriadis, and Lasch were attempting to develop. In the case of Horkheimer and Lasch, the economic theory that informed their cultural criticisms can be traced back, at least in part, to Friedrich Pollock, which is to say that Lasch, when he needed to make an assertion about economic matters, and particularly about economic crisis, turned to Paul Sweezy, who co-wrote his book Monopoly Capital with Paul Alexander Barron, who worked under Friedrich Pollock at the Plekhanov Institute in 1928. And of course, Pollock was the major economic thinker in the Frankfurt School, especially after Horkheimer ostracized Heinrich Grossman. Sweezy and Barron's book on monopoly capital argued that once competitive capitalism was overcome, monopoly capital could be managed without a major risk of economic crisis. The surplus generated by workers could rise indefinitely once the chaos generated by private capitalist competition was placed under the control of centralized economic managers. And with this change to Marxist theory, with the replacement of Marxist theory of capitalist crisis with one of monopoly capitalist stability, the revolutionary ambitions of the intellectual vanguard were subdued. In 1995, Sweezy was 85 years old and working for the Monthly Review. In an essay entitled Reminiscences, he wrote, "My analysis of the performance of the U.S. economy during the last 60 years is accepted. To what policy conclusions does it point? Public ownership of the means of production and planning to meet the needs of all people won't be a serious option, not anytime soon. The question should therefore be reformulated. What could be done within the framework of the private enterprise system to make it work better?" What we might notice is how this idea that monopoly capital could control and overcome the unevenness and inequities seemingly innate to capitalist relations was both understood as something to be lamented and as the new supposedly Marxist goal. As long as fixing capitalism remains the project that supposed Marxists and communists set for themselves, as long as we cannot imagine the liberation of the working class but only dream of a better and more humane approach to the management of capital, to the management of workers and one another, it will be easy for conservatives to both conflate something like this reset with world revolution and to blame the distorted forms of living, the lockdowns, the poverty, the economic turmoil, on a far-left conspiracy. Christopher Lasch was a ruthless cultural critic of the elites, who he saw as disconnected from everyday working people and who, especially in their progressive guise, were a hindrance to left projects for self-emancipation. However, by taking on the reformism that defined even the radical left of his time, he placed himself in a position wherein the only alternative to joining the progressive coastal elites was to embrace the socially conservative elites who themselves wanted nothing more than to solve the problems and irregularities in society by taking a step back into patriarchal family structures, religious institutions, and the fantasy of rural communitarian life. The far right is paranoid about the way COVID is being used by the elites to create a global dystopia. But this is as much the fault of the way the socialist left has allowed the progressive statists to become the left, as it is the fault of a con artist like Alex Jones. And as I move ahead with Christopher Lasch next week, we'll take a look at his critique of lifestyle politics. I'll continue to keep an eye out for moments wherein his ruthless critique turns into total resignation based on a misunderstanding of political economy. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.